Yeah, welcome to the May meeting of the Northwest Suburbs Fiscal and Economic Issues Group. And we're going to go over a lot of stuff that's facts. So you have those facts so you can know what they are. They help
Karl,
sharpen your arguments, communicate to your audience.
you're not in
And now,
slideshow mode.
yeah, I'll try and get this over. But anyhow, I'm going to let Bill introduce a little bit about what is NWSOFA and talk a little bit about trying to get a little money from everybody.
I think everybody's probably tired of hearing about getting a little money. But I'm Bill Davis. I'm one of the co-leads for the NWSOFA chapter. NWSOFA stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. Prior to the pandemic, we were a group of about 4,000 within 6 townships in the Northwest area of Chicago, the land beyond O'Hare, as people like to say it. Then the pandemic hit, and we discovered Zoom, and we no longer were constrained by any boundaries. And today we have over 5,200 members, people joining from various countries and across the U.S., not just from the Chicagoland area. We're an organization that has 24 leaders like Karl and David, who you'll hear from tonight, who are experts in their subjects. And each month they bring us a meeting to allow people to discuss, or maybe it's a presentation per se, or a combination of those two. But as Karl said, it's a way to inform and to allow people to be to have good arguments when people are talking about the economy and, in broad senses, the political natures of how things have gone. So, with that, one of the big things is twice a year we do have a fundraising program, and Indivisible National. We are one of 6,400 chapters. Indivisible National will double the contributions up to $500, and so we are about $1,000 or about $100 away from our goal, and we would appreciate it if you could give $2 to $5 if you get good content out of these programs. During the program, we'll put up a couple links to the website Act Blue, where you literally can donate. So with that, I want to turn this over to one of our longest running issue groups, our Fiscal and Economic group, that has been headed by Karl Faulstich for a good 8 years, and Dave Doney for 7 years. And they have just been dynamic. I hope you enjoy. Karl?
Well, welcome, everybody. Tonight we're going to talk about the labor market and the good news there. We're going to talk about GDP, what's happening with deficits and debt. We're going to have a short session on modern monetary theory basics, some data about household financial positions and how that has changed, and some other economic indicators. So that's the agenda for tonight. Go ahead and put questions in the chat, and we'll try and monitor those. But if we need to stop, if you want to unmute yourself and shout out a question at some point, because it won't make sense to come back to it. We can deal with that as well. Job creation is one of the big things going right in the Biden administration. You probably all remember that with the pandemic, we lost 22 million jobs over the course of 2 months. Back in, well, what's got reported as March and April was actually February through April. We got back some of those jobs while Trump was president. We regained all those lost jobs by June of 22, and we are currently 6 million more jobs than prior to the pandemic. So we haven't, if our friends on the right tell us we're just regaining the lost jobs that were lost during the pandemic, no, we've added 6 million more jobs than what was lost during the pandemic. the other thing to remember, of course, it was President Trump in the middle of March suggested shutting down all the schools and bars and restaurants, slow down the spread of the pandemic, the COVID virus. So anyhow, got good job growth, and this is showing that it has slowed down. And when we get the replacing all the lost jobs, it's been slower than before. If you look at prior presidents, anything over 100 to 150,000 jobs a month is pretty good jobs record. So even the slower job growth here is pretty darn good. Now, recently, President Obama's second term, we were at 216,000 jobs per month being added. Trump, prior to the pandemic, we were adding 180,000 jobs a month. If you go all 4 years of Trump, including the pandemic hit in 2020, we actually lost 57,000 jobs a month, or a little over 2 million jobs over the course of his 4-year presidency. So he did not have a good jobs record. Even before the pandemic hit, it was slower job growth than prior to him taking office. And with the pandemic, it's abysmal. Biden, from inauguration, great job growth because that includes the recovering some of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic. But even once we got back to where we had regained all the jobs that had been lost, we still had pretty darn solid job growth, better than almost every other president since July 2022, when we got back to where the pre-pandemic level of jobs. The unemployment rate, just before the pandemic, the U3 rate, which is what's generally talked about, was at 3.5% and actually stuck up a little bit in February. And then the U6 rate is the U3 rate. So the U3 rate is people who are not working, who did not work during the month, but have actively looked for work during the prior month or the prior 4 weeks. And the U6 rate is people who did not work during the month, have actually looked for work at some point during the past year. And it's also people who are working part-time jobs who want full-time jobs. So that's why the U6 rate is a higher rate than the U3 rate. We see the U3 rate at 3.9%. The U6 rate is at 7.4%, which is about as low as it's been in its history. And this is the unemployment rates, including all the months that the presidents were in office, and as well as only the pre-pandemic months, because we don't want, to be fair, we're not going to penalize for what was happening during the pandemic for purposes of this comparison only. What we see is that basically the unemployment rate overall was lower under Biden for the different ethnic groups. And it's also true, even if you exclude the pre-pandemic or the pandemic months. The unemployment rate presidential averages, this of course helped if you come in with a fairly low unemployment rate. So for instance, Trump came in when the unemployment rate was 4.7%, and it wasn't until 3 years in that it started to go higher, and when he left office, it was 6.3%. But this comparison makes him look pretty good because he had a low average, even though the unemployment rate went from 4.7% to 6.3% on his watch. So you also have, people like Reagan who had the unemployment rate. He's the only Republican that he inherited a fairly high unemployment rate, and it took him a while to get it under control. Every Democrat actually had the unemployment rate go down on his watch. Okay, so there's 2 surveys every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. One is the one that gives the payroll jobs, which is what we just saw. The other is the household survey, which gives overall jobs, which includes 1099 jobs, Uber drivers, Grubhub deliveries, Uber Eats, etc. And so the jobs here, the employed here is higher than what we had on the jobs numbers a few slides back. And last month in April, we had an increase in the population of 16 and over. We had an increase in the civilian labor force. The labor force participation rate stayed constant. The number of employed went up a little bit. The employment to population ratio stayed constant. The unemployed went up a little bit, and the unemployment rate ticked up a fraction of a percent. So basically stayed at went from 3.8 to 3.9%. So, basically good data, slower job growth than what we were seeing a year ago, which actually makes the Fed kind of happy because they think there's less inflationary pressure. They might actually lower interest rates. This is, when we look at things, the employment to population ratio of prime age workers, 25 to 54, is a good group to look at because these people tend to not still be in school and they tend to not yet be retired. And so it's a core group, the 25 to 54 group. We see is that prior to the pandemic, 80.5% of that group was employed, and now it's at 80.8, so up slightly, even with the pandemic. Obviously, it dipped way down and it's crawled back up. So the other thing, the payroll employment doesn't really capture this, but the household survey captures whether people are working full-time or part-time. Based on what we see, and this starts them both at 100% as of February 2020, and says since the pandemic started, full-time jobs dipped, they've grown, they're back higher than they were. Part-time jobs dipped, they actually got back higher than they were. Well, they're now back down to about where they were. And we have more full-time workers than part-time workers. This is a little distorted just to understand that the blue line here is 133.9 million jobs, and the red line is 27.7 million. So there's a lot more full-time workers than part-time workers. And most of the part-time workers actually want to be working part-time. They're students, retirees, housewives, people that don't really want a full-time job. Again, going back to the EU6 rate, and the number of people who are working part-time that want a full-time job is actually somewhere around 5 million of this 27.7 million. And it's still relatively easy to find a job. Not as easy as it was 2 years ago. What we had back before the pandemic was job openings were 1.2 times the number of people who were unemployed. We're now at 1.3. So still a little better than pre-pandemic, but not where we were 2 years ago when we actually had 2 job openings for everybody who was unemployed. And again, unemployed, just to clarify, does not mean that you're collecting unemployment benefits. It's in answer to the survey, did not work, you were looking for work. But anyhow, that's so the unemployment level, the insured unemployment level is about 1.5%. All right, GDP is gross domestic product, the size of the economy, and it's generally calculated by quarter. We are currently in the second quarter, and we're getting data for the first quarter because there's a lag in all the data. The first quarter of the calendar is January through March. For purposes of calculation, it's actually November through March, with a heavy weight towards the first quarter is weighted towards January, just to keep us confused. So GDP is a measure of the size of the economy, production or output. corresponds to GDI, which is GNI, corresponding measure of income. 40 some years ago, my macro text called it gross national income. We'll live with this. This is probably the current terminology. And what we have is prior to the pandemic, the economy was 20.95 trillion in real terms, and now it is 22.7, 22.8 trillion in real terms. Real meaning adjusted for inflation. So real GDP growth under Biden, looks like what we've got here, started out pretty well, inherited the recovering from the pandemic. We had the invasion of Ukraine. I think that's what we're dealing with here. Relatively slower growth, and then last fall, pretty good growth. First quarter back down to 1.6%, which is still decent. For comparison purposes, Trump was at 2.0% for his presidency. Obama was at 2.1 or 2.2%. Bush 43 was at 1.8%. Clinton was at 3.7%. Bush 41 was at 2%. And Reagan and Carter were both at 3.4% for their presidency. And this is the components of GDP, what grew, what didn't, what contributed to that 1.6% growth. Big thing is consumer spending. And imports tends to be a subtraction. And I'll let you guys look at this at your leisure. Again, we have put the link to this presentation in the PowerPoint. I mean, in the chat. Hopefully, Bill will do it again and copy it in again shortly, so that everyone who wants it can get it. And the fine print of contribution to real GDP. And anybody who's getting into that level of detail doesn't need us. Okay, so we see again what I was talking about. The Obama combined terms is 2.2%. Trump overall was 2%. Pre-pandemic, he was at 2.84%. Biden through the first quarter of this year is at 2.75%. So we're looking at pretty good GDP growth under Biden. Not bad under Trump, especially pre-pandemic. Of course, he promised us we were going to get 4% growth if we gave him his tax cuts. So we didn't quite get that. If we look at the growth in the US versus growth in other countries in the G7, we see that the US economy has grown by 8.2%, 2019 pre-pandemic, and other countries have not so stellar growth. Canada's not bad, Italy's not bad. Otherwise, we're more than twice the growth of any of the other economies in the G7. And this is what we're talking about, that immigrants, and including long-term immigrants, account for a lot of the growth. So, I mean, this can include, from my neighborhood here in the city, all the Vietnamese boat people that came in the 70s after the end of that war. Major immigrant group that is included in this accounting contribution to U.S. growth. So again, real GDP growth over time, we see that similar to the last slide, the U.S. has the best growth. And you probably have read numerous times over the last couple of years of different people predicting recessions. And we were practically guaranteed a recession in 2023. This is the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the group that actually determines whether we're not in a recession. And most of its indicators of whether or not we're in a recession are showing green. We are not in a recession. The only one that's showing a little bit lower is industrial production. Doesn't mean we won't get a recession in the next couple of years, especially if we elect a Republican president, because, as I'm fond of saying, the last Republican president who did not have a recession start on his watch was James Garfield, who served 6 months back in 1881. Every other Republican president has had a recession start on his watch. 10 of the last 11 recessions started under Republican presidents. In other words, contrary to popular belief, if you want a good economy, don't elect a Republican president. Deficits and debt. Are there any questions about GDP?
Hey, Karl, I do have a question.
I'm sorry.
So GDP obviously is going up any sense of what percent of that is a military, the amount of ammunition, the amount of stuff that we are producing and sending over to Ukraine?
Karl, can you go back to the contribution slide?
I was going to say it's a small piece.
Tiny. The next one. No, you passed it. The contribution one. It's the next one. There you go.
Okay.
So when you look at the federal government spending, so it's that G that is the negative 0.01, that one. That is how much, all of the government spending, defense and non-defense, is contributing. One of the tricky things with the government spending you have to be careful with is that all of the stuff that is welfare type stuff, or entitlements, they call it, mandatory programs like Social Security, Medicare, all of those transfer payments from the government flow through consumer spending. So, if you were to say what's going on with where is Social Security or Medicare or any of that other stuff, any people are spending is over there in the C, consumer spending on the left. The government spending, and then all that is going to be defense spending and what's called the non-defense spending, the discretionary spending. Each of those is like $1 trillion and something. So the government spends like $6 trillion, but you don't see that in the federal government spending bucket. They're really analyzing that $2 trillion number, the discretionary categories, meaning they're the budget every year. And so the short answer to your question is it's actually that category, because that amount is shrinking a little bit. It's actually dragging on GDP. It's lowering it.
Perfect.
It is not part of it. Yeah, one of the mysteries, people will be very surprised, in 2022 and in 2023, we spent less than 2022. So spending has fallen each of those 2 years that Biden actually budgeted. And so that's been a little bit of a drag on GDP through that bucket that Karl showed you, the 0.01 negative bucket.
So another way to look at your question, Bill, is that in the first quarter of 2024, total GDP was at $22.8 trillion in 2017 dollars. So it's actually a little higher than that. And these are trillions. And we just passed a huge support for Ukraine of 60 billion, or a tiny fraction of this number.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
That I'm looking at here, David?
Correct.
So.
Correct.
Okay. So what we're seeing is that for fiscal year 2023, fiscal year 2024, we have a 7-month deficit of 857 billion, or down 68 billion. So it's a little lower. And that's what David was talking about, that the spending and the deficit have been coming down under Biden. Well, spending as a percentage of GDP.
The spending was coming down in 2020. It's fallen each year from 20 to 22 to 23. It kept coming down. This is 2024. And so the spending's up a little bit, 6% up, and revenues are up 10%, that stuff in the upper right corner.
Okay, so this is future deficits, not historic. What we see is that deficit was a little over $1.5 trillion. The 2024 deficit is projected to be a little under $1.5 trillion. It goes up. And then what we see later on, again, this is if laws don't change under current law, but we still have, 10,000 Americans a day turning 65. And so we've got a lot of increases in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid spending during these out years. It's kind of built into the economy and what any president would inherit. And interest payments, as the debt has gone up, but more importantly, as the interest rate has gone up, we see that it's a big portion of the deficit. So the primary deficit, which is without interest, is below $1 trillion in most years, but including the interest being paid, our deficits are going to be well over $1 trillion. These are the kinds of graphs I like to see this on the unemployment rate as well, but the change in the deficit during the presidency. President George W. Bush inherited a surplus and left with a really big deficit. Trump actually inherited a $665 billion deficit and left with a $1.8 trillion deficit, if I'm remembering correctly. No, is it 1.8 or 2.8? 2.8 is last year. So we see is that in general, red Republican presidents tend to increase the deficit, and blue Democratic presidents tend to decrease the deficit. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that Republicans are just unlucky, and their policies seem to always result in recession. So, any questions on this section? Yes, no, maybe?
You had a question that just came in from Amy.
Okay, welcome, neighbor.
Isn't it also tax breaks is the question? And Karl, can you go back to the deficit slide that shows the deficit projection for 10 years or so? It's the one before that one. Well, that includes it, or this one right here. So this is a loaded question because that's very interesting. It's one of my favorite subjects. It's very incredibly boring subject, but let me explain it this way. All those loopholes, so the deductions, the exemptions, the lower preferential rates, like for capital gains, all of that stuff. You see how big these blue lines here? They're like $1.5 billion, something like that. The amount of that last year, the amount of tax breaks you get off of just paying the income tax rate table is bigger than that blue line. Meaning if you took all those away, the deficit would be zero, or we'd have a small surplus, other things equal. And I say other things equal because if you do get rid of all of those things, there may be some changes in behavior so that you might not get it quite that much money. But for example, I'll use the capital gains because that's one of my favorites. Almost all the benefit goes to the rich because they're the ones that are buying and selling the stocks and have large portfolios. And so, like, I forget the exact number, but somewhere like 75 to, let me think, it's almost like 90% of that benefit goes to the top 1% or some ridiculous amount of it. And it's like 100 or 150 billion a year. So it's a large amount of money that the government does not get because it offers 20% rate on capital gains, as opposed to the full rate that you'd be paying, 37% or whatever, if you're a rich person, paying that top table bracket. So all those deductions and exemptions, and some of them are near and dear to us, like mortgage interest or property tax deductions, or there's some more complicated ones. There's a long list of them, but you don't have to take them away from everybody. You can take them away from just rich people, and the top 20% get about half of that. So you could probably get, if you just eliminated those deductions, exemptions, etc., they're called tax expenditures. If you got rid of those for just the top 20%, it would be about $1 trillion, and that's per year. So there is a huge amount of money that the government sort of gives away. It's called a tax expenditure. It's no different from spending. It's not taking the revenue and essentially either never taking it or giving it back to people. You could solve your deficit problem by getting rid of the tax expenditures for the top 20% if you wanted to.
Okay.
So when you hear the stories about how there's just not enough money with the rich, you got to cut government spending, that's a conservative myth. Don't believe that. You could get rid of the tax expenditures alone, as I've just explained, and more than cover or bring your deficit down. If you just did it for the top 20%, you could bring that deficit down to nothing, to a very small number. Does that answer the question? You can certainly talk. You can unmute yourself and speak. We're pausing on purpose. By all means, engage if you want. Hopefully that answers the question.
Remind me if I'm wrong, but as the Trump tax cuts are scheduled to phase out over the next couple of years, these are under existing law. So this assumes that those tax cuts will phase out.
Correct. That's right.
And so if we extend the Trump tax cuts, these deficits get bigger.
That's right. And you could figure, I saw some numbers on it, depending on if you add the interest costs and all this other stuff, it's between like $4 and $6 trillion over a decade. So if you divide, let's use 5 as a round number, that's $500 billion a year starting in 2026 and beyond. And remember that the Trump tax cuts for the individuals are the ones that will expire after 2025. The tax cuts for corporations are permanent, meaning they will continue until a law changes them. But the individuals, as part of the law, those expire, and the Republicans did that because of the reconciliation process, because they weren't going to get Democratic support. To get it through the Congress, they had to limit the amount of the cost of the thing over a period of years. For a little bit of history, the Obama extended about 80% of the dollar value of the Bush tax cuts. So if we extend 80%, if assuming Biden wins and extends 80% of the value of the Trump tax cuts, as he sort of pledged to do, because he said he won't tax people that make less than 400,000 anymore, he's probably going to do pretty similar to what Obama did. What's 80% of 500? 400 billion of that is going to continue. So he's talking about really just, shaving 20% off of that additional cost that's going to go in there. But those tax expenditures, if you do a search on CBO, Congressional Budget Office, CBO tax expenditures, you'll get good links right away. And it's an amazingly, shockingly high number, because if you think about what all the expensive tax lawyers do, they help rich people get tax breaks. And that's what they do. That's how they operate. And over the years, they have just added and added and added. Just unwinding those would be a tremendous increase in revenue. And you don't have to even raise the income tax rates to get it.
So Amy's question is along those lines. Isn't it also tax breaks that increase the deficits?
That's it. Yep.
Yes.
That's what we talked about. That's it. We got her covered.
So a question to Karl. I know that Karl has talked in the past about the debt forgiveness that's been going on to students, etc. What percent of this budget is that we're literally giving back? What is it? 10 grand per, 8 grand per student that kept up with their payments?
There's a whole bunch of different rules for debt forgiveness, student debt forgiveness, and I don't know what they all are.
We have a slide coming up on that. So hang on. It's page 49. I don't know if you want to zip there now, Karl. We can. It's no biggie. I think it's 49 on my version. Let me see it. Yep. Okay. So what's going on here is, you all heard the 400 billion number that came out earlier when Biden originally said he was going to forgive student loans, and that got blocked by the Supreme Court. But what he's managed to do with a bunch of other authorities that he's got, or at least through the laws that are currently on the books, he's been able to forgive 400 billion in other ways. And that's the top colored line here that goes, it's adding up to 397 billion currently. I don't have the number on this page about how many students that is, but there are like 44 million people with student loans, and it's a large percent of that. It's like 30 million people have been touched by this one way or another. So he's managed to find 400 billion to forgive. It's different from the 400 billion we heard about before. He's going at it in different ways. And this chart comes from the American Enterprise Institute, so this is not a liberal organization. So this is what they're saying Biden has done. And so far, the Supreme Court has not blocked any of these other efforts. They blocked the executive order for the fell swoop 400 billion, but that's it. Now, to your point, Bill, about how big is it? 400 billion, our deficit is $1.5 trillion-ish now every year. So this is 400 billion. It's a quarter of 1 year's deficit.
And it's forgiveness over multiple years.
Right.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, it's not a lot. It's shocking when you hear say 400 billion isn't a lot of money, but in the scheme of how big our economy is, $6 trillion a year in spending, it's not a lot. But it's a big deal if you're somebody that got $10,000 break. That's a big deal for you as an individual. That's for sure.
Okay, do we want to go ahead and take a break now, or?
This is a good time for a short break. Yeah.